For 13 months, there has been no electricity in Gaza. And that's what has gone on over the last year. And as horrific as that situation is, what is taking place today, now, as we speak, is even worse. As a result of Israel blocking desperately needed humanitarian aid in recent weeks, the volume of aid getting into Gaza is lower than at any point since the war began. More aid is needed, less aid is getting through. The result, and let's be very clear about this, the result is that many, many thousands of children are facing malnutrition and starvation. According to very recent UN reports, quote, the situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. The entire population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence, end of quote. And Israel's recent decision to ban UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, will only make a horrific situation even worse. Clearly, what is happening in Gaza today is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of what is happening there has been done with U.S. weapons and with American taxpayer support. In the last year alone, the U.S. has provided $18 billion in military aid to Israel and delivered more than 50,000 tons of military equipment. In other words, and this is the most important point to be made, the United States of America is complicit in these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and in violation of our moral values. It is also time to make clear to Netanyahu that he cannot continue to undermine U.S. foreign policy goals. The U.S. government wants a ceasefire for hostage deal. Netanyahu has prevented a deal to preserve his coalition. The U.S. government wants more humanitarian aid to reach desperate people in Gaza. Netanyahu is blocking it. The U.S. government wants to contain regional escalation. Netanyahu has refused diplomatic off-ramps and launched several reckless attacks without consulting the United States. The U.S. government wants to stop settlement expansion and settler violence in the West Bank. Netanyahu and his ministers have driven record settlement expansion and armed extremist settlers. The U.S. government wants a plan for post-war governance in Gaza. Netanyahu will not engage. And by the way, blocking these sales would also be in keeping with actions taken by some of our closest allies. The UK suspended 30 arms export licenses after concluding there was an unspeakable risk that they could be used in violation of international law. Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands have taken similar steps. UN bodies have called for an end to the arms shipment fueling the conflict. So let me thank all of you again for being here. Let me hand the mic over to Senator Merkley. Jeff?
Thank you, Bernie. I stand before you today as someone who has spent a lifetime advocating for Israel's economic success and for their security in a very difficult part of the world. I was 21 when I went to Israel and hitchhiked throughout the country, stayed at a kibbutz, proceeded to swim in the Dead Sea and the Red Sea and the Med Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and I've been back to Israel a number of times and seen the phenomenal, successful country they have built as a startup nation, as a nation that solved its energy challenges, as a nation that reforested, and have always felt I'd be voting for each effort to assist Israel with security. And I will continue to support defensive weapons for Israel, for David's sling, for a variety of undertakings, and I would gladly support financing of a far more effective barrier that could not be easily penetrated from Gaza into Israel, giving Israel full time to respond to what happened in the horrific day of October 7th. But the Netanyahu government has undertaken policies that are out of sync with American values. And that's why I'm here at this moment. It's President Biden who referred to it as indiscriminate bombing. That bombing has produced massive deaths, massive injuries, massive destruction, and the largest part of the calamity has been on the innocents, not those who conducted October 7th attack. And we are, as a nation, providing the weapons that are being used in Gaza. Therefore, we are, as citizens, complicit in this strategy that is out of sync with our values and out of sync with our law and out of sync with international law. Even the report that came under NSM 20, and I really applaud Senator Van Hollen for his leadership on so many things related to the Middle East, but particularly having that national security memorandum created, found that our weapon supplies were inconsistent with obligations under international humanitarian law or with practices to mitigate civilian harm. So it is important, even when we have an ally, even when there is a country that has been a close friend, that it engages in egregious, devastating practices that harm civilians in such a massive way, that we stand up and say, this is wrong, it's wrong under our law, it's wrong under international law, it's wrong under moral values to conduct a campaign in this fashion. And that's why I'll be supporting these three resolutions opposing transfer of weapons, offensive weapons to Israel. And I'll turn this over, I think, to Peter Welch.
Thank you very much, Bernie and Chris and Jeff. Thank you. Really appreciate the work you've done on this. You know, there's a question that America has to face, and it is about the role of humanitarian considerations in the conduct of our foreign policy. The argument is being made against injecting what clearly is a concern for the humanitarian catastrophe that is now continuing in Gaza, as to whether the long-term commitment that the United States has had to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state can coexist with that. All of us here support Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. All of us here believe in the two-state solution. All of us believe that the relationship we've had with Israel is special. And all of us here are appalled at what Hamas did to slaughter 1,200 innocent Israelis. And all of us here support the right of Israel to defend itself. But what has unfolded in the name of that defense is the loss of 43,000 and rising Palestinians, many of whom are women and children and non-combatants, not at all connected to Hamas. What has happened is over 100,000 children and innocent bystanders have been severely injured, including amputation. And what's unfolding before our very eyes right now is mass starvation and the spread of disease. Is the United States in its foreign policy, with that commitment we've had to Israel, forced to be blind to the suffering before our very eyes, particularly when it's our munitions that are being used? Should we be blind to the suffering of those Palestinian women and children when Top military officials in Israel themselves have said that there's no further military purpose for continued bombing and military activity in Gaza. Our view is no, that the humanitarian considerations are important. It's consistent with the Leahy Law, and we should enforce it. It's consistent with humanitarian international law, where the power that is occupying or in control has an obligation to facilitate, not impede, the delivery of life-saving aid. So I stand here as a person who believes that there's no inconsistency with the United States asserting conditions on aid that are consistent with our commitment to our own policies, a two-state solution, the enforcement of the Leahy Law, the enforcement of international law. You know, when I think about the conflict that the United States had with Russia for so long, the Soviet Union, there are many historians who think one of the most significant components of what made us so successful was our civil rights movement. The commitment that was on display to the people around the world of our struggle to try to broaden the reach of civil rights for every person. Isn't that the same situation we face, where we have before us every single day evidence of more suffering of women and children in a situation where there's no military purpose to be served by the continuation of using our weapons, and where it's in total conflict with us having any chance of achieving a two-state solution, and where the result of this activity is escalation in Lebanon, escalation even in Syria, and the rising violence in the West Bank, and where politicians in Israel, including Netanyahu and many others who support him, are talking about annexing the West Bank and completely and utterly turning their back on a two-state solution. This is very important for Congress to act. And it's an action that's consistent with the long-term commitment we've had to Israel's security, and it's a commitment that should be a long-term commitment we have to the inclusion of humanitarian considerations in our foreign policy. Thank you.
Senator Ben Hollen.
Well, I want to start by thanking Senator Sanders for introducing these joint resolutions of disapproval. I think it's a very important moment for the United States Senate. And what these resolutions stand for is the simple proposition that U.S. taxpayer assistance should not come in the form of a blank check, even to our closest partners. We need assurances that U.S. interests, values, and priorities will be respected by foreign governments that receive American support. That principle should apply universally, including to the Netanyahu government in Israel. But even as the United States has provided billions and billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer-financed bombs and other offensive weapon systems, we've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly violate the terms of American security assistance, disregard U.S. priorities, and ignore our requests. A partnership should be a two-way street, not a one-way blank check. Like all of my colleagues, in the aftermath of the horrible Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th, I have repeatedly supported Israel's right to defend itself and end Hamas's control of Gaza, and I remain steadfast in that support. There must be no more October 7ths. But how you conduct that defense matters. A just war must nevertheless be waged justly. And that's why recipients of U.S. weapons must comply with American laws and policies. Recipients of security assistance must, number one, facilitate and not arbitrarily restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance into war zones where U.S. weapons are being used. And two, American-supplied weapons must be used in accordance with international humanitarian law. The Netanyahu government is violating both of these requirements in Gaza. I would just turn everyone's attention to first the phone call that President Biden had with Prime Minister Netanyahu on October 9th, where he said the situation in Gaza was already bad and it's getting worse, and as Senator Sanders says, it's getting apocalyptic. That was followed up by a letter from Secretaries Blinken and Austin on October 13th. Their letter was to then Defense Minister Gallant and to Ron Dermer. I would remind people that the Minister of Defense Gallant has since been fired by Netanyahu from the government because he prioritized a return of the hostages and a ceasefire. In fact, I just met with the father of one of the people who's still hostage right now in Gaza, who supports this resolution. In that letter, the secretaries, Secretary Blinken and Austin, referenced U.S. law. They referenced 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. They referenced NSM 20, the President's National Security Memorandum. And they said this: the humanitarian situation for over 2 million civilians in Gaza is increasingly dire. They also said trucks carrying humanitarian commodities, including perishable goods funded by the United States, are delayed at crossing platforms. We are particularly concerned that recent actions by the Israeli government, including halting commercial imports, denying or impeding nearly 90% of humanitarian movements between northern and southern Gaza in September, and continuing burdensome and excessive dual-use restrictions, among other things they list, are impeding the delivery of absolutely necessary life-saving aid. They then go out in this letter to spell out what needs to happen in order to meet the conditions and standards of U.S. law and policy. I'll just read from the first part. Ahead of winter surge, all forms of assistance throughout Gaza by, number one, enabling a minimum of 350 trucks per day to enter into Gaza. They have a number of other elements, including removing restrictions on the use of container and closed trucks and increasing the number of vetted drivers to 400. They go on to list a number of other criteria. And the reality is, with maybe minimal change, these conditions that Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken laid out have not been met. Just ask the folks at UN agencies responsible for monitoring humanitarian aid in Gaza, and ask the humanitarian organizations who are delivering aid in Gaza. Here's what 15 United Nations and humanitarian organizations said on November 1st. They said, and Senator Sanders quoted this, the situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. They said rescue teams have been deliberately attacked and thwarted in their attempts to pull people buried under the rubble of their homes. They said the entire Palestinian population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. They said humanitarian aid cannot keep up with the scale of the needs due to the access constraints. Basic life-saving goods are not available. Humanitarians are not safe to do their work and are blocked by Israeli forces and by insecurity from reaching people in need. They go on from that. They also say member states of the UN, must use their leverage to ensure respect for international law. This includes withholding arms transfers where there is a clear risk that such arms will be used in violation of international law. I would point out that among the people who signed that letter was Cindy McCain. Cindy McCain is the head of the World Food Program. Cindy McCain does not sign letters lightly. She takes her job seriously. I would point out that Kathy Russell, who's the executive director of UNICEF, another American appointee, signed this letter. Cindy McCain tweeted out on November 8th, quote, "The unacceptable is confirmed. famine is likely happening or imminent in North Gaza. Immediate steps must be taken to allow safe, rapid, and unimpeded flow of humanitarian and commercial supplies to prevent an all-out catastrophe now, in capital letters. I want to reference a Washington Post story on November 13th that came out after the deadline that had been set by Secretaries Austin and Blinken. They said, we need this to be addressed in 30 days. I think all of us believe that they were already in violation. The Netanyahu government was already in violation. But things have clearly gotten even worse since they wrote that letter. And so we would expect there to be some consequences when things get even worse. So the Washington Post stated, and we confirm this, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has refused to publicly disavow the plan which calls for the military to take control of the north by starving out the civilian population and treating everyone who remains as combatants. It goes on to say the IDF says it has been given no such orders and is focused on dismantling Hamas, but the ongoing military operation in the north appears to have much in common with that strategy, a strategy laid out by one of the Israeli commanders to starve people. And the Post goes on to say they conducted their own analysis after interviewing lots of individuals, and they concluded that it was clear, as we can see, that the Netanyahu government was not meeting the requirements set out in the letter sent by the U.S. government. And so it is time that we take some actions. I want to just reference two other things. That letter also said, and I would refer to you, I know some of you are aware of this, but that letter also had another comment in it. It's the very last paragraph. This is the letter from Secretaries Austin and Blinken. Lastly, it is vitally important that our governments establish a new channel through which we can raise and discuss civilian harm incidents. Our engagements to date have not produced the necessary outcomes. We ask that the initial virtual meeting of this channel be held by the end of October. I don't know if that's been held, but this is a very consequential statement because we know from reporting that there are about 500 incidents that are being reviewed by the Department of State where U.S. weapons were used, where there was believed to be unnecessary civilian harm. And it's the obligation of the U.S. government to follow through on those cases and determine whether or not there was a clear violation before sending more bombs and more weapons, and yet that has not been done. I will finally point out, Bernie, that this letter had two other things. One, saying don't pass the legislation. Don't have the Knesset pass the legislation banning UNRWA. Days after this letter went out, they did it. It also says that the ICRC, as required by international, needs to have access to prisoners. That still has not happened. So every single one of the elements that was raised in this letter from the United States government has either been blatantly violated or not met. And that's why we need to use the recourse we have to pause U.S. offensive military assistance, including these three JRDs, until the Netanyahu government finally comes into compliance and begins to listen to the priorities of the United States government. So thank you, Bernie.
Okay, any questions? Ma'am? You're with whom?
Oh, AP, Friday. You and your colleagues have written numerous letters in the past few months to the Biden administration, to the White House, asking for a number of things, including humanitarian aid, the sanctioning of Israeli officials who are allowing the settler violence in the West Bank. Have you received any response to any of those letters? And second of all, President Joe Biden has no more elections left to run. He has few weeks left in his government. Why do you think he has not taken action on this?
I don't want to speculate on what President Biden has done or will do. That's a question for the White House. To the best of our knowledge, we have not gotten satisfactory answers to any of the letters that have been sent. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm with Reuters. How would you respond to the fact that no resolutions of disapproval have ever passed and survived the veto?
Look, what will happen, and I'm not here to tell you how many votes we will even get. What we're talking about here, and every one of my colleagues have made the point, we're talking about a simple legal issue. We may be old-fashioned, but we kind of think that the United States government should obey the law. That's number one. And number two, from a moral perspective, all of us are appalled that the United States of America is complicit in the starvation and malnutrition of many, many thousands of children and others in Gaza. That's the issue before us. Sir?
Thanks, Senator Mark with Jewish Insider. You introduced 6 of these resolutions. 3 are coming up for a vote.
Right.
How did that come about, and why these 3 specifically?
I think these are 3 that I think most members can get their arms around and see as having an immediate impact in destroying the lives of people in Gaza. So they're very specific, and I think that they are, frankly, resolutions that will probably attract the most support. Anybody else want to jump in on those? But that's kind of the answer. Not complicated. Ma'am, in the back.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember your time. So it doesn't appear that you're going to get very much at all GOP support on these resolutions. I mean, there's been a long time to campaign to try to politicize the Israel issue, make Republicans out to be the more pro-Israel party, Democrats to be anti-Israel. I'm wondering where you think this kind of fits into all of that, if that could be exacerbating this particularly, and something that you merit in yourself, you know, if there is something that you think is given that political environment at the time.
I don't want to get into the political implications of that. You know, we just came through an election. People can draw their own conclusions of why there was a decline in young people voting, and Democrats aren't doing particularly well with young people. I really don't want to get into that. I happen to believe that the American people will not be sympathetic to any member of Congress who is turning his or her eyes on the kind of horrendous suffering that is now taking place in Gaza, and in fact, going out of their way to block humanitarian aid. So that would be my response.
If I could just
Sure,
say
Chris, jump
something
in.
on that, because, and I don't want to get into the politics part either, but your question, you said whether they're more pro-Israel, pro-Netanyahu party. And there's a really important distinction, as you know, between those two things. And my view is that it's not pro-Israel to provide the Netanyahu government with unconditional assistance. And I've heard that from many Israelis. So I just want to make that important distinction. You can be pro-Israel and at the same time strongly oppose the policies of this very right-wing extreme Netanyahu government.
Okay, 1 or 2 more. Yes. From who? Medill. Okay.
We see reports that Secretary Blinken ignored conclusions from constituent agencies which found arbitrary denial and blockage of humanitarian aid, but he told Congress that this is not occurring and it was being allowed in. Has this administration been honest with Congress, and if it has not, should there be accountability?
Well, I think we've discussed that issue. Chris just talked about that. Yes, ma'am.
Abigail Housen, of the Washington Post. I know you said you don't want to talk about politics, and you want to talk about politics, but clearly most of your colleagues in the Senate do not see this the way you do. Why are more Democrats, at least, not joining you on this?
Look, others can comment. I don't want to get into the politics of it because this is such a, poignant and painful humanitarian issue. Other members, you can ask them, they will tell you why they feel the way they do. But anyone want to add to that? But I don't want to speak for other members. All right, maybe one more. Gentleman back there, yeah.
Yes, Senator. Matt Sloan with the Intercept. You mentioned that, several people mentioned that letter from the administration to Israel. What can you do to hold the administration accountable for the letter it sent to Israel and follow through on its
Chris, do you want to?
Well, I'll be pretty blunt. I think the Biden administration has failed to follow the law and failed to follow its own policies that bind the administration, including NSM 20. And the facts are very clear on this point. And the reason I wanted to mention the letter is because you would think after a letter like this was sent, things would at least get a little better. They've gotten a lot worse. So what's the point in sending a letter if you don't mean what you say?
Okay.